Good afternoon from Sacred Space at Titania's Realm. It's Friday the 3rd of April 2026 and the time is 1:27 p.m. So this is my second attempt to make this video because I just did a big spiel and realised we weren't filming. Oh! But what I was telling you in my first attempt was that I had a good long sleep, which was healing and therapeutic and kind. And then I got up at 11:54 a.m, slept from 3 till almost midday. And I went out to look for Cynthia Snake, but she's moved on somewhere else. She was probably annoyed by me watching television till 3 o'clock in the morning with the vibration of sound beaten down through the floorboards down to her position under the eaves. So she's moved on, and I'm sure she's around the garden somewhere. I'm still going to have to be cautious when I take the birds outside. But anyway, it's a bit of a relief that she's not tucked up under the eaves right next to my staircase anymore, because that was a little bit creepy. And it's a beautiful day. I think we're going to get some rain. So happy Good Friday, and happy Easter to the Christians, and happy third day of Passover to we Jews. Is it the third day? Evening of the first, second. Yes, we've begun the third day at sunset last night. So third day of Passover for the Jews, and happy Ostara to the pagans. Happy I don't care as long as I get a day off work day to the atheists and the agnostics and everyone else who doesn't observe any ritualistic or spiritual or religious content. As above, so below. We exist with or without you, and we all have our paths and destinies and parts to play in this mosaic of miracle that is life. Yin and yang, people of earth. So on that note, I'll continue reading Tonka by Robert Musil, Musil. Chapter 1. Now this is a very long story, so it's going to be the video probably get broken into 2 or 3 parts. Also depending what level of pain I find myself having to endure. So let's carry on, people of earth. Chapter 1. At a hedge, a bird was singing, and then the sun was somewhere down behind the bushes. The bird stopped singing. It was evening, and the peasant girls were coming across the fields, singing. What little things! Is it petty if such little things cling to a person, like burrs? That was Tonka. Infinity sometimes flows in drips and drops. And the horse was part of it too, the roan that he had tied to a willow. It was during his year of military service. It was no mere chance that it was in that year, for there is no other time of life when a man is so deprived of himself and his own works, and an alien force strips everything from his bones. One is more vulnerable at this time than at any other. A bit like having a tooth yanked out of your head. But I woke up feeling incredibly powerful this morning, even though the pain was starting to radiate again, upon wakefulness. I was like, I'm doing okay. Day by day, moment by moment, breath by breath. What did they say in French? Formidable. Formidable. But yesterday I was really struggling. The pain was intense. The Panadol Osteo didn't touch the side, so I reverted back to ordinary Panadol and got a little bit of relief then. And then I had this energy supercharge from about 10 p.m. at night until 3 a.m. Talked to my friend Tarina on Messenger and in messages. Spun fleece, and then was going to go to bed when I finished talking to Tarina around about 11 p.m. Got an energy burst of energy, so I just kept spinning and watching Vladimir, which was a very good show, very interesting. So I had a good night last night, but yesterday, there were moments when I thought about, well, you know how it goes when you fall into the abyss. Had to drag myself out of it a few times actually. So it's sort of still a struggle of mind over matter. But don't worry. Kurt Cobain gets me through. Come as you are, as a friend, as I hoped you would be. Hurry up, take your time. The choice is yours. Don't be late. Well, here I am, carrying on. It's amazing. Right. But had it really been like that at all? No, that was only what he had worked it up into later. That was the fairy tale, and he could no longer tell the difference. In fact, of course, she had been living with her aunt at the time when he got to know her, and cousin Julie sometimes came visiting. That was how it had been. Excuse me. I've done a very naughty thing and devoured an entire packet of biscuits. That's why I'll never be a supermodel, but I just needed it. So I regret nothing, even though it was naughty. That was how it had been. He remembered being disconcerted by their sitting down at the same table with cousin Julie over a cup of coffee, for she was, after all, a disgrace to the family, like the biscuit eaters in our family. They're very good biscuits. I very much enjoyed them. Chocolate on one side and biscuit on the other. But now I feel fat. Well, everything will come back into equilibrium when I feel less ongoing torture with this ongoing pain. Right. It was notorious that one could strike up a conversation with cousin Julie and take her back to one's lodgings that same evening. She would also go to the bawdy houses whenever she was wanted. She had no other source of income. Still, she was a relative after all, even if one didn't approve of the life she led. And even if she was a light woman, one couldn't very well refuse to let her sit down at the table with one. Anyway, she didn't come very often. A man might have had a row about it, for a man reads the newspaper or belongs to some association with definite aims, or is always throwing his weight about. But Auntie merely made a few cutting remarks after Julie had gone, and let it go at that. So long as she was there, they couldn't help laughing at her jokes, for she had a quick tongue and always knew more what was going on in town than anyone else. So even if they disapproved of her, there was no unbridgeable gap between them. They had something in common. The women from the jail were another example of the same thing. Most of them were prostitutes too, and not long afterwards the jail itself had to be moved to another district because so many of them became pregnant while serving their sentence, carrying mortar on the building sites where male convicts worked as bricklayers. Now, these women were also hired out to do housework. For instance, they were very good at laundering, and they were very much sought after by people in modest circumstances because they were cheap. Tonka's grandmother also had one in on washing day. She would be given a cup of coffee and a bun. Since one was sharing the work with her, it was all right to share breakfast with her too. There was no harm in that. At midday, someone had to see her back to the jail. That was the regulation. And when Tonka was a little girl, she was generally the one who had to do it. She would walk along with the woman, chatting away happily, not in the least ashamed of being seen in that company. Although these women wore grey prison uniform and white kerchiefs that made them easily recognisable. Innocence, one might call it. A young life in all its innocence, pathetically exposed to influences that were bound to coarsen it. But later on, when the 16-year-old Tonka was still unembarrassed, gossiping with cousin Julie, could one say that this was still all innocence? Or was it that her sensibilities were blunted? Even if no blame attached to her, how revealing it was. The house must also be mentioned. With its 5 windows looking onto the street, it was a survival between towering new buildings that had shot up around it. It was in the back premises that Tonka lived with her aunt, who was actually her much older cousin, and her aunt's little son, the illegitimate offspring of a relationship that she had regarded as permanent. And a grandmother who was not really the grandmother, but the grandmother's sister, In earlier days there had also been a brother of her dead mother's living there, but he too had died young. All of them lived together in one room and a kitchen, while the genteel curtains of the 5 front windows concealed an establishment of ill repute where lower middle class housewives of easy morals, as well as professionals, were brought together with men. This was something that the family tacitly ignored, and since they wanted no trouble with the procuress, they even passed the time of day with her. She was a fat woman, very set on respectability. She had a daughter of the same age as Tonka. Whom she sent to a good school. So I'm getting stabbing pains, probably from the cold drinking water. Whom she sent to a good school and took care to keep her well away from the business. She was a soft-hearted creature, which made it easier for her to follow the trade she did, for she knew it was shameful. In earlier times, Tonka had, now and then, been allowed to play with this daughter, and so had found her way into the front part of the house. At hours when it was empty, and to her the room seemed enormous, leaving her with an impression of grandeur and refinement that was only reduced to proper proportions after he came on the scene. Tonka was not her real name. At her baptism, she had been given the German name Antoni, and Tonka was the abbreviated form of the Czech diminutive Toninka. The inhabitants of those back streets talked a queer mixture of the 2 languages. But where do such thoughts lead? There it was. She had been standing by a hedge that time, in front of the dark open doorway of a cottage, the first in the village as one came out from town. She was wearing laced boots, red stockings, and a gaily coloured, stiff, full skirt. And as she talked, she seemed to be gazing at the moon, which hung pale over the corn stalks. She was at once pert and shy, and laughed a lot, as though she felt protected by the moon. And the wind blew across the stubble fields as if it were cooling a plate of soup. Riding home, he had said laughingly to his comrade-in-arms, young Baron Mordunsky, "You know, I shouldn't at all mind having an affair with a girl like that, only it's too dangerous for my liking. You'd have to promise to make up a threesome to keep me from going sentimental." And Mordunsky, who had done a spell as a trainee in his uncle's sugar mill, had thereupon told him about how, when the time came round for digging the beets, hundreds of such peasant girls laboured in the fields belonging to the mill, and it was said they were as submissive as black slaves to the supervisors and their assistants. And once, he remembered quite distinctly, he had cut short a similar conversation with Mordansky because it was an affront to his feelings. Yet it had not been at that time, he knew. What was now trying to impose itself on him as a memory was really something else. The tangle of thorns that had later grown inside his head. In reality, it was in the ring that he had first seen her, in that main street with the stone arcades, where the officers and the gentlemen who worked in the government offices stood chatting at corners. The students and young businessmen strolled up and down, and the girls wandered along in twos and threes, arm in arm, after the shops closed, or the more curious of them, even during the lunch hour. As sometimes a well-known local lawyer would make his way slowly through the crowd, lifting his hat to acquaintances, or a local deputy, or say a respected industrialist. And there were even ladies to be seen on their way home after shopping. There her glance had suddenly crossed with his, a merry glance, lasting only for the briefest moment, like a ball accidentally landing by a passerby's face. The next instant she had looked away with a feigned air of innocence. He had turned round quickly, supposing that now the usual giggling would follow, but Tonka was walking on, looking straight ahead of her, rather tensely. She was with two other girls, and taller than either of them. She was not beautiful, but her face had a clear-cut, definite quality. There was nothing in it of that petty, cunningly feminine look which seems to result from the face as a whole. In this face, mouth, nose and eyes were each something clearly in their own right, and could stand up to being contemplated separately, delighting the beholder simply by their candour and the freshness irradiating the whole face. It was odd that so gay a glance should stick fast like a barbed arrow, and she herself seemed to have hurt herself with it. Now I'm getting the most dreadful earache. It's very painful. It's all connected to my choppers, my poor beleaguered choppers. So much was now clear. Well then, at that time, she had been working in the draper's shop. It was a large shop, employing a great many girls to handle the stock. Her job was to look after the rolls of material and get the right one down when it was asked for. and the palms of her hands were always slightly moist because of the irritation from the fine hairs of the cloth. You would think it would make your hands dry, wouldn't you? There was nothing dreamlike about that, and her face was guileless. But then there were the draper's sons, and one of them had a moustache like a squirrel's, turned up at the ends, and always wore patent leather shoes. Oh, I do love patent leather shoes too. Tonka was full of stories about how smart he was, how many pairs of shoes he had, and how his trousers were every night laid between two boards and weighed down with heavy stones to keep them well pressed. And now, as he got a clear glimpse of something real through the mist, that other smile emerged, the incredulous smile his mother wore, essentially an onlooker's smile, full of pity and disdain for him. That smile was real. What it said was, "Heavens, not that shop, surely?" And although Tonka had still been a virgin when he came to know her, that smile, treacherously furtive or masked, had also turned up in many a tormenting dream he had. Perhaps it had never existed as a single smile. Even now, he could not be sure of that. And then, too, there are nuptial nights when one cannot be entirely sure. There are, so to speak, physiological ambiguities, times when even nature does not give an unequivocal answer. And in the very moment when he remembered that, he knew that heaven itself was against Tonka. Chapter 2. It had been rash of him to bring Tonka to act as nurse and companion to his grandmother. He was still very young then. He had worked out a little stratagem. Tonka's aunt, who went out doing sewing for the gentry, sometimes worked for an aunt of his, and he had contrived that she should be asked if she happened to know of a young girl who, and so on. The idea was to get a girl to look after his grandmother, whose merciful release was to be expected in a couple of years. Apart from her wages, the girl would be remembered in the old lady's will. Don't count on that, motherfuckers. Sorry. Wills and old ladies reminds me of my mother and the will dispute. Evil it was, the purest of evil. And yet there has been no merciful release for me. Wow. Better times are coming, as my beautiful Cockney English Jewish friend of my mother and friend to me, Auntie Sylvia, used to love to say. "Don't worry, darling," she'd say to me. "Hold on. There's better times a coming." Sweet, innit? She buoyed me up many times over the years, but she passed away. When was it? 2013 or 14? I can't remember now. Anyway, to you, Auntie Sylvia, Chag Sameach Pesach. Do they celebrate Passover in heaven? Probably not. Anyway, but she liked that little joke. She had a great sense of humour. We really were quite similar, her and I, laughing in the face of ordinary reality. But meanwhile, there had been a number of little episodes. Once, for instance, sorry, I'm getting waves of pain. Once, for instance, he was going on an errand with her. There were some children playing in the street, and suddenly they both found themselves gazing at the face of a little girl who was howling, a face that wriggled and her eyes like a worm in the full blast of sunlight. The pitiless clarity of it there in the light seemed to him a symbol of life, over against the orbit of death that they had both just left. But Tonka was fond of children. She bent down to the child, cheerfully and consolingly, perhaps even slightly amused by it. And that was all, however much he tried to make her see that behind the appearance there was something else. From however many sides he approached it, in the end he always found himself confronted with the same opacity in her mind. Tonka was not stupid, but something seemed to prevent her from being intelligent. And for the first time he found this wide expanse of pity for her, this pity that was so difficult to account for. Another time he said to her, "Tell me, how long is it now that you've been with Grandmama, Fräulein Tonka?" And when she had told him, he said, "Oh, really? It's a long time to have spent with an old woman like that." "Oh," Tonka exclaimed, "I like being here." "Well, you needn't be afraid to tell me if you don't. I can't imagine how a young girl can manage to put up with it." "It's a job," Tonka answered and blushed. "All right, it's a job." But that isn't all one wants from life. Isn't that true? Yes. And have you got that? No. Yes, no, yes, no. He grew impatient. What's the sense of talking like that? Can't you even grumble about us? But he saw that she was struggling to find an answer, that she kept on discarding possible answers just when they were on the tip of her tongue. And suddenly he felt sorry for her. I dare say you'll hardly know what I mean. It's not that I think badly of my grandmother, poor woman. No, it isn't that. I'm not looking at it from that point of view at the moment. I can't help thinking of it from your point of view. And from your point of view, she's a perfect old horror. Now do you see what I mean? Yes, she said in a low voice, blushing more than ever. I understood all right before, but I can't say it. At that he laughed. That's something that's never happened to me. But now I'm more curious than ever to know what you really think. I'll help you. He looked at her so intently that she became more embarrassed than ever. All right then, here goes. Do you like just having regular duties? A quiet, steady routine? Is that it? Well, I don't know quite how you mean. I like my work all right. You like it all right? But you're not exactly mad about it, I suppose. I mean, there are people who don't want anything but a steady job. What are you getting at? Desires, dreams, ambition? That's what I'm getting at. Doesn't a fine day like this start something up in you? Between the stone walls of the streets, the day was full of a quivering light and the honey of springtime. Now it was she who laughed. It isn't that either. It isn't that? Well then perhaps you have a special liking for darkened rooms, for talking in a whisper, for the smell of medicines and all that. There are such people too, you know. But I can tell from your face that I haven't hit it this time either. She shook her head and faintly turned her mouth down at the corners, perhaps in shy mockery, perhaps only out of embarrassment. But he gave her no peace. You see how wrong I go, how ridiculous I'm making myself in your eyes by keeping on guessing wrong like this. Doesn't that help you to come out with it? Come on now. And now, at last, she came out with it, slowly, hesitantly, as if choosing her words carefully in order to make intelligible something that was very difficult to understand. You see, I have to earn my living. Ah, how simple it all was. What an ass he had been, and what a stony eternity lay in that so ordinary answer. And another such time was once when he had secretly gone for a walk with Tonka. They used to go for long walks in the country whenever she had her day off, which was twice a month. It was summer. When evening came, the warmth of the air was exactly the same as that of one's face and hands. And you can hear the sound of someone bouncing the ball, but I can't see anyone. It's odd, isn't it? Must be my neighbours. Right, so where was I? Drifting people there. When evening came, the warmth of the air was exactly the same as that of one's face and hands, and walking for a moment with closed eyes, one felt as though one were dissolving, expanding, floating. He described this to Tonka, and when she laughed, asked her if she knew what he meant. Oh, yes. But he was still not sure that she did. And so he tried to get her to describe it to him in her own words, and this she could not do. So then he said she didn't know what he meant. Oh, but she did. And suddenly she said, "It made you want to sing. For heaven's sake." But yes, that was it, she protested. They went on wrangling like this for a while, and then, after all, they both began to sing, rather in the spirit of someone firmly placing the corpus delicti on the table or inspecting the scene of the crime. They sang pretty badly, and something from a musical comedy at that, but fortunately Tonka sang softly, and he was glad of that little sign of consideration for his feelings. He was positive she had not been to the theatre more than once in her life, and that ever since then these trashy tunes summed up her notions of culture and elegance. However, it turned out that she had merely picked them up from the other girls at the shop where she had worked. He asked her if she really liked these tunes. It always annoyed him to come across anything still linking her with that shop. She did not know what it was, whether this music was beautiful or silly, merely that it made her want to be on the stage herself and put her whole heart into making the people in the audience happy or sorrowful. This was perfectly ridiculous, of course, in the light of what poor dear Tonka looked like while she was singing. It depressed him, and his own singing faded out on a sort of growl. Then Tonka suddenly broke off too, as if she felt the same thing, and for a while the two of them walked along in silence. Then Tonka stopped and said, "That's not what I meant at all about singing." And since she saw in his eyes a little glint of responsive kindness, as she began to sing again, still softly, but this time folk songs from her own part of the country. So they walked along with these simple tunes, making everything vaguely sad, like the fluttering of cabbage whites in the sunshine. And so now all at once it turned out, of course, that Tonka was right. Now it was he who could not express what was going on in him, because Tonka did not talk the ordinary language that other people used, but some language of the totality of things. She had had to suffer being thought stupid and insensitive. He realized now what it meant if one said, "Songs just come into her head." It seemed to him that she was very lonely. If it were not for him, who would understand her So they both sang. Tonka recited the Slavonic words and translated them into German for him, and then they joined hands and sang together like children. Whenever they had to leave off to regain their breath, there would be a little moment of silence ahead of them too, where the twilight was creeping across the road. And even if the whole thing was foolishness, the dusk itself was at one with their feelings. And yet, another time, they were sitting at the edge of a wood, and he was simply gazing into space through half-shut eyelids, not talking, letting his thoughts roam. And Tonka began to be afraid she had offended him again. Several times she took a deep breath as if about to speak, but then shyness held her back. So for a long time there was no sound but the woodland murmur that is so tormenting, rising and sinking away at a different place at every instant. Once a brown butterfly fluttered past them and settled on a long-stemmed flower which quivered under the touch, swaying to and fro, and then quite suddenly being quite still again, like a conversation broken off. Tonka pressed her fingers hard into the moss on which they were sitting, but after a while the tiny blades stood up again, one after the other, row on row, until there was finally no more trace of the hand that had lain there. It was enough to make one weep, without knowing why. If she had been trained to think like her companion, at that moment Tonka would have realized that nature consists of nothing but ugly little things that one hardly notices, and which live as sadly far apart from each other as the stars in the night sky. The beauties of nature. A wasp crawling over his shoe. Its head was like a lantern. He watched it, contemplating his shoe, which was sticking up broad and black, oblique against the brown of the earth. But Tonka had often thought with dread of the moment when a man would stand before her and she would have no way of escape. The stories that the older girls in the shop had told her with such delight gave her a feeling only of a crude, boring frivolity, something that was not love at all. And she was indignant at the way men were always making amorous advances to her after scarcely exchanging more than a few words with her. As she looked at her companion now, she felt a sudden pang. It was the first time since she had been with him that she realized he was a man, for this was something completely different. He was laying back, resting on his elbows, his chin on his chest. And timidly, she tried to see into his eyes. What she saw was a peculiar smile. He had one eye shut, and with the other he was gazing along the length of his body as though aiming at something. Doubtless he knew how ugly his shoe looked at that angle, and perhaps, too, how little it amounted to that he was lying at the edge of a wood with Tonka. But he did nothing to change anything about it. Each detail was ugly, and the whole thing was happiness. Quietly, Tonka got up. She suddenly felt a burning inside her head, and her heart was thudding. She could not make out what he was thinking, but she read it all in his eye. And all at once she caught herself wanting to take his head in her arms and cover up his eyes. "It's time to go," she said. "It'll be getting dark soon." As they were walking along the road, he said, "I'm afraid you must have been bored, but you will have to get used to me." He took her arm, because it was becoming difficult to see the road distinctly, and he tried to excuse himself for his silence, and then almost against his will for his thoughts too. She did not really know what he was talking about, but in her own way she sensed the meaning of his words, which came so gravely through the rising mist. And when now he went further, even apologizing for talking in such a solemn way, she did not know what to do. Even her silent prayer to the Blessed Virgin was of no avail, and so she linked her arm more closely with his, although she felt dreadfully shy of doing so. He stroked her hand. "I think we get on well together, Tonka. But do you really understand me?" After a while, Tonka answered, "Doesn't matter if I know what you mean or not. I couldn't say anything anyway, but I like you to be serious." These were all very slight experiences, of course, but the remarkable thing was that they happened all over again, exactly the same. Actually, they were always there, and even more remarkably, later they meant the very opposite of what they had meant in the beginning. Tonka always remained so simply and transparently the same that it was almost like having an hallucination, seeing the most incredible of things. Let's just see how long the next chapter is. Right, we'll carry on a little bit longer, people of Earth, but I'm starting to fade. So one more chapter and I think we'll call it quits for today. Chapter 3. There came an event. His grandmother died before the expected time. Events are, after all, only things that happen untimely and out of place. Yes, Kermie. As one is, as it were, mislaid or forgotten, and one is as helpless as an object that nobody bothers to pick up. Hello? And even the events that took place much later were only the things that happened thousands of times, all over the world. Pretty boy. Mama's pretty boy. And the only incomprehensible thing about it was that it should have happened with Tonka. Well, and so the doctor came, the undertaker's men came, the death certificate was signed, and Grandmama was buried. One thing followed on the other quite smoothly, as is proper in a respectable family. The will was read. He was glad not to be in any way involved. There was only one item among the bequests that demanded attention. The provision made for Fräulein Tonka with that dreamlike surname, one of those Czech surnames that mean things like he sang or he came across the meadow. There was a contract. Under the term of the will, the Fräulein was to receive, apart from her wages, which were low, a certain fixed sum for every completed year of service. And since it had been assumed that Grandmama would linger on for quite a while, and since the sum had been fixed in gradually increasing amounts in accordance with the expected increase in the strain of nursing her, it turned out to be a sum that was bound to seem outrageously small to a young man who weighed out in minutes the months of her youth that Tonka had sacrificed. He was present when Hyacinth reckoned up with her. He was pretending to read. The book was Novalus's Fragments, but in reality he was attentively following what was going on. He was ashamed when his uncle named the sum. Even his uncle seemed to feel something similar, for he began to explain to the Fräulein in detail the terms of the contract that had been made when she entered their service. Tonka listened intently, her lips tightly closed. The solemnity with which she followed the calculations gave her young face a very appealing look. "So then that's correct, isn't it?" his uncle said, laying the money on the table. It was obvious that she had absolutely no idea what it was all about. She pulled out her little purse, folded the notes, and squashed them in, but though they were few, folding them so much made a thick wad of them. And when the little purse had been replaced under her skirt, it made a bulge on her thigh, like a swelling. She had only one question to ask. "When do I have to leave?" "Well," his uncle said, "I suppose it will be a few days before the house is shut up. You can certainly stay till then, but you can also go before that if you like, as you won't be needed anymore." "Thank you," she said, and went off to her little room. Meanwhile, the others had begun sharing out the old woman's things among themselves. They were like wolves devouring a dead member of the pack, and they were already in a state of general irritation when he asked whether the Fräulein, who had got so little money out of it all, should not at least be given something of some value in memory of Grandmama. "We've decided to give her Grandmama's big prayer book." "Well, yes, but I'm sure something useful would please her more. What about this, for instance?" He picked up a brown fur tippet that was lying on the table. "That's for Emmy, a cousin of his. And anyway, you must be mad. It's mink." He laughed. "Is there any law that poor girls can only be given something for the good of their souls? You don't want to make a miserly impression, do you?" "I'd thank you to leave that to us," his mother said, and because she did not think he was entirely wrong, she added, "These are things you know nothing about. She won't be treated unfairly." And with a gesture at once lavish and irritable, she put aside for Tonka some of the old woman's handkerchiefs, chemises and drawers, and then added a black woolen dress that had scarcely been worn. "There, I think that'll do. It's not as though the Fräulein has been such a treasure. She can't exactly be called sentimental either. She never shed so much as a single tear, either when Granny died or at the funeral. So please, don't let us hear any more about it." "And some people don't cry easily. I mean, that doesn't prove anything," he said. Not because it seemed important to say it, but because he felt the urge to argue for the sake of arguing. "That will do," his mother said. "Don't you realize that your remarks are out of place?" At this rebuke he fell silent, not because he was in awe of his mother, but because but because suddenly he felt vastly pleased at the thought that Tonka had shed no tears. His relatives were all talking eagerly, all talking at once, and he noticed how skillfully each of them turned the situation to his or her own advantage. They expressed themselves, if not clearly, at least to some purpose, and with the courage of their convictions. In the end, each of them got what he or she wanted. For them, the ability to talk was not a medium of thought, but a sort of capital, something they wore like jewellery to impress others. As he stood by the table with the heaps of things to be given away on it, he found himself recalling a line of verse. "To him Apollo gave the gift of song and music, sweet to hear." And for the first time he realized that it really was a gift. How inarticulate Tonka was. She could neither talk nor weep. But how is one to define something that neither can speak nor is spoken of, something that dumbly merges with the anonymous mass of mankind, something that is like a little line scratched on the tablets of history. What is one to make of such a life, such a being, which is like a snowflake falling all alone in the midst of a summer's day? Is it real or imaginary? Is it good or evil or indifferent? One senses the fact that here the categories reached a frontier beyond which they cease to be valid. Without another word, he left the room and went to tell Tonka that he would provide for her. He found her packing up her things. There was a big cardboard box on a chair, and there were two others on the floor. One of them was already tied up with string. Two others were not big enough for the amount of stuff still scattered about the room, and she was trying to solve the problem by taking things out again and putting them in differently. Stockings and handkerchiefs, laced boots, and sewing things, laying them first this way and then that. However scanty her possessions were, she would never get everything stowed away, for her luggage was still scantier. Since the door of her little room was ajar, he was able to watch her for some time without her knowing. When she did notice him, she blushed and quickly stepped in front of the open boxes. "And so you're leaving us," he said, charmed with her embarrassment. "What are you going to do now?" "I'm going home to Auntie." "Do you mean to stay there?" She shrugged her shoulders. "I shall look around for something." "Won't your aunt be vexed?" "I've got enough for my keep for a few months. In that time I'll find a situation." "But that means using up your savings." "Can't be helped, can it?" "And what if you don't find it so easy to get a new job?" "Then I shall just get it served up to me again at every meal." "Get what served up? How do you mean?" "Not bringing anything in. That's how it was when I was working at the shop. I wasn't bringing much home, but I couldn't help that. And she never said anything. Only if she was angry. Then she always did." "And so then you took the job with us?" "Yes." "Look," he said abruptly, "you mustn't go back to your aunt. You'll find something else. I'll see to that." She did not say yes or no. She did not thank him. But as soon as he had gone, she began slowly taking one thing after another out of the boxes and putting them in their places. She had blushed deeply. Now she could not collect her thoughts, and every now and then stood still with something in her hand, gazing blankly ahead of her, simply realizing, so this was love. But when he had gone back to the room where Novalis' fragments was still lying on the table, he was suddenly aghast at the responsibility he had taken on. Quite unexpectedly, something had happened that would determine the course of his life, and it was something that did not really concern him intimately enough. At this moment, he perhaps even felt slightly suspicious of Tonka, because she had accepted his offer without more ado. Then he began to wonder, what on earth made me propose such a thing? And he did not know the answer to that question any more than why she had accepted. Her face had revealed just the same helplessness and bewilderment that he had been feeling. The situation was painfully comical. He had gone rushing up somewhere as in a dream, and now he did not know how to get down again. He had another talk with Tonka. He did not want to be anything but completely honest with her. He talked of personal independence, of intellectual values, of having a purpose in life, ambition, his distaste for the proverbial idyllic love nest, his expectation that he would later have affairs with women of higher social standing. Talked, in fact, like a very young man who wants a great deal and has experienced very little. When he saw something flicker in Tonka's eyes, he was sorry and all at once overcome by quite a different feeling, the fear of hurting her. He pleaded, "Don't misunderstand what I've been saying." "I understand all right," was the answer Tonka gave. Perhaps one more chapter. You can tell I'm enjoying this story when I want to forge ahead, even though I'm arriving considerable discomfort. Chapter 4. "But she's only a common little thing who used to work in that draper's shop," they had said. What was the point of that? There were plenty of other girls who were quite ignorant, who had never been educated. Talking like that was like pinning a label onto the back of the girl's dress where she couldn't get at it and take it off. What they meant was that people had to have learned something, had to have principles, had to be conventional and have the right manners. Simply being a human being wouldn't do. And what of all of them who had all that and who did do? It seemed to him that his mother was afraid of seeing the emptiness of her own life repeating itself in his. Her own choice was not one that she was proud of. Her husband, his father, had formerly been an officer of the line, an undistinguished, jolly man. She was bent on seeing her son have a better life. She fought for that. Fundamentally, he approved of her pride. So then why did the thought of his mother leave him unmoved? Duty was second nature to her, and her marriage had taken on meaning only when his father fell ill. Henceforth, she assumed a soldierly aspect, standing on guard, defending her position against overwhelming odds. Sounds a bit fucking familiar, except I've been doing this alone for 31 years. Fuck. Anyway, at the sight of this man who was steadily declining into imbecility. Up to then, she had not been able either to go ahead or to withdraw in her relations with Uncle Hyacinth. He was not a kinsman at all, but a friend of both parents, one of those uncles with whom children have to put up with from the age when they begin to notice things. He was a senior civil servant, and besides, a popular writer whose books sold very well indeed. He brought Mother the breath of culture and worldly sophistication that consoled her in the intellectual desert she lived in. He was well-read in history, with ideas that seemed all the more grandiose the emptier they were, extending as they did over the sweep of the centuries and the great problems of man's fate. For reasons that had never become clear to the boy, his mother had for many years been the object of this man's steadfast, admiring, selfless love. Perhaps it was because, as an officer's daughter, she had high standards of honour and duty, which were the source of all the moral integrity that lent her glamour in his eyes and made her the model for the heroines in his novels. Perhaps, too, he was obscurely aware that both the fluency of his talk and his narrative gift derived from his own lack of such integrity. But since he naturally did not care to acknowledge this as a deficiency, he had to magnify it and transform it into something universal, full of the lacrimae rerum, seeing the need to be thus complimented by another's strength of spirit as the inevitable destiny of one so rich in intellectual resources as himself. Thus the situation had no lack of agonizing exaltation for the woman either. Even in their own eyes, they were at pains to disguise their liaison as a spiritual friendship. But in this, they were not always successful. At times, they were quite dismayed by Hyacinth's weakness of character, which would land them in dangerous situations, and then they would not know whether to let themselves fall or strong-mindedly climb back again onto their wonted heights. It was only when her husband became ill that their souls were provided with the support they needed, and, reaching out for it, they gained that inch of spiritual stature which they had sometimes felt lacking. From that time on, she was armoured in her duty as a wife and was able to make up by redoubled dutifulness for whatever sins she still committed in spirit. And by a simple rule that settled everything for them, they were now safe from that particularly distressful wavering between the obligation to be greatly passionate and that to be greatly loyal. So that was what respectable people turned out to be like, manifesting their respectability in terms of mind and character. And however much love at first sight there might be in Hyacinth's novels, anyone who without more ado simply went after another being, like an animal that knows where it can drink and where not, would to them have seemed like a wild primeval creature, devoid of morality. The son, who felt pity for that good-natured animal, his father, in all the little matters of family life, fought Hyacinth and his mother as though they were a spiritual plague. Thus he had let these two drive him into the diametrically opposite corner of the field of contemporary attitudes. This brilliant and versatile young man was studying chemistry and turned a deaf ear to all questions that had no clear-cut answers. He was indeed an embittered opponent of all such considerations, and was a fanatical disciple of the cool, soberly fantastical, world-encompassing spirit of modern technology. He was in favour of doing away with the emotions. He was the antagonist of poetry, kindness, virtue, simplicity. The songbirds need a branch to perch on, and the branch a tree, and the tree the dumb brown earth to grow in. But he flew. He was between the ages. He was somewhat in mid-air. After this age, one that destroys just as much as it constructs, there will come one that will inherit the new premises we are so ascetically creating. And only then will it be possible to say that we ought to have what we ought to have felt about things. And such was more or less his train of thought. For the time being, the thing was to be as tough and as austere as on an expedition. With such a strong intellectual drive, he could not fail to attract his teacher's attention, even as a schoolboy. He had conceived ideas for new inventions, and after taking his degree was to spend 1 or 2 years devoting himself to working them out, after which he hoped to rise, surely and steadily, above that radiant horizon which is a young man's image of his glamorous, unknown future. He loved Tonka, because he did not love her, because she did not stir his soul, but rinsed it clean and smooth like fresh water. He loved her more than he himself believed, and the occasional tentative, needling inquiries made by his mother, who sensed a danger that she could not come to grips with because she had no certainty of it, impelled him to make all speed. He sat for his examinations and left home. Tempted to do one more chapter, but yes, it's going to be a 3-part video and I'm fading out. So Goddess bless to my beautiful subscribers, viewers, likers, commenters, friends, family, countrymen, fellow earthlings. Have a wonderful Easter weekend, or in my case, Passover weekend. Not that I, as you can tell when I described eating an entire packet of biscuits earlier, I'm not keeping a kosher Pesach Passover. I'm still eating chametz, heathenish. But I'm not well, and I didn't have the energy or the money. It actually costs a fair bit to put on a proper Seder and buy in all the food and do all the cooking and all the cleaning and all the ritualistic part of all that preparation. And I mean, I did it for many years. Now I haven't done it for quite some years, so it swings and roundabouts. Maybe I should write a short story. Do they celebrate Passover in heaven? Do they celebrate Easter and Christmas in heaven? I think every moment in time is a celebration in heaven. That's why it's heaven. So perhaps I should concentrate more on making my own personal heaven for my remainder of my days on earth, if I'm going to be constantly smashed by fate and forced to endure the withering of my physical corpus and constant onslaughts against my physiognomy due to a rot and 5G EMF radiation, COVIDian shedding and other onslaughts against my body that I'm no doubt barely surviving. It is what it is. It really is what it is. I'll show you what I did yesterday when I was writhing in agony yesterday, most of the day. Awful it was. I had a moment of temper, a moment of adrenaline rush. So I went out and I smashed this little piece of boulder opal that I got cheaply, trying to see if I could break apart the little vein of opal, but in smashing it, I just broke off little pieces, and so there's a little tiny vein of opal there. There isn't much opal in this little rock, so it's barely worth polishing up really, but I don't know, it's still pretty. But and then this tiny little piece broke off that still had some opal in it. We're out of focus, people of Earth. Can't quite see it. It's on the end there. There. You can see it. Ah, here we go. There. Tiny little piece. I might actually, I don't know, try and do something with that, although it's tiny. And then a tiny little piece I broke off there. I don't know what I'm going to do with those little tiny pieces. It was just a moment, just some kind of madness came over me because of all the pain I'm in, and have these flights of fantasy and little tiny tantrums. This one I didn't smash up because actually what I want to do, and it's bonkers, but there's a shape there that looks like, I don't know, a railway man with his cap on his head, and he's got his hands behind his hips, chest puffed out with a kerchief around his neck. I want to try and preserve that and cut it out somehow, as it just looks like a person standing there, and it just tickles my fancy. There's only a tiny bit of opal actually in amongst it, and when and if I polish it up, probably lose the opal. So, but if I smash it up, I risk losing that little quirky caricature that was created by nature, or is the spirit of this particular piece of boulder opal. So I haven't smashed up this one because I didn't want to lose that. Sometimes the Mama T and her creativity can be quite childlike and magical, but that's the joy of being a creative, isn't it? Is that you get to be childlike and magical, and it sparks joy and gives you something to look forward to and distract from all the other ghastly fucking horror, like the state of my jaw right now. So anyway, that's today's offerings to you, people of Earth. Have a beautiful day wherever you are in the space-time continuum, and a peaceful and joyous holiday. And remember, as always, what does the Mama T always say? Never ever let the bastards grind us down. Bye for now.